Good afternoon or good morning, everybody. So first and foremost, I want to apologize. I am sick. I'm in that season of child rearing that I just feel like it's a new sickness every week. I don't even know what's going on. It's it's a new era. So more power to everybody who made it through that. Um, Caffeine and Dayquil are keeping me together. So we're going to get through this. But it is Thursday, September 12th. It's 1 p.m. Eastern, and we do this show every single week. Now, before we get into our normal freight market roundup, which is our episode today, every other week, I want to quick start us off with a quote from the United States Maritime Alliance, which is also known as the USMX. So it's a statement they made last week. It's in regards to the current contract negotiations they're having with the International Longshoremen's Association. So here it goes. We hope the ILA will reopen dialogue and share its current contract demands so we can work together on a new deal. But the IOA has continued to strongly signal that they have already made up their decision to call a strike. Now, the reason why I am sharing this with everyone is if for some reason you think there won't be a strike on September 30th, I strongly consider you dive into what's been going on here. I'm going to cover some of it today, but from a rhetoric standpoint, from a standpoint of where each side is at on their contract, there is so much space between where they are and where they need to be. Really, they're barely discussing at this point. So you need to plan on a strike happening on the East and Gulf Coast ports on September 30th or the day after. So keep that in mind. Now, let's get right back to it. Because if this is your first time joining us, welcome. It's our weekly ship show. My name is Jason Brand. I'm the Director of Outreach and Partner Development at Supply Chain Solutions. So SCS, that's what we call ourselves from an acronym standpoint. We're a full service supply chain and transportation management organization. And we also ship between more than 150 countries on a yearly basis. But beyond that, we handle every single link in the chain. That means customs, that means inventory management, that means domestic shipping. We do milk runs. We do a substantial amount. We actually started as a consulting organization back in the early 2000s. And from there, we've blossomed into this kind of really amazing shipping and also inventory management company. And we love working with customers that have unique problems. And it's also a really good time to kind of lay the groundwork for what is your supply chain strategy going to look like the next 10 years, because that's pretty much what's happening right now through most of the carriers. It's a good time to kind of take a look at, hey, where's our new advantage points? Where's our disadvantage points? And just figure out what makes sense. Give us a call. You can always reach out to us via the website or myself directly. But yeah, let's get on with the show. So as I mentioned, we've got the freight market roundup. It is a broad stroke view of the shipping market. It is from a U.S. viewpoint, so keep that in mind. But we're going to run through what our customers are currently paying when it comes to ocean rates, when it comes to air rates. And also, we really like to touch on the current events that our teams are dealing with or managing or struggling with, but also events that our customers have reached out to us about and said, hey, what's going on here? Hey, give us some advice on this. We like to kind of bring that up on these episodes. We send this out to our customers as well, just so they have an idea. And we've got this kind of unified broad message. But let's dive in. We've got a short but informative one today. So before I, get back into the what's going on in the East and Gulf Coast port negotiations, let's first talk about what's happening in the ocean shipping market. So let's start with the Trans-Pacific lane. More specifically, think about the Trans-Pacific in terms of this show as shipments that are coming from Southeast Asia or China, and they're headed into the U.S. West Coast ports. So as of last weekend, our customers were paying an average of $6,200 per 40-foot container, or FEU for short. This lane actually hit a high back in the first week of July. It topped off at right around $8,000 per FEU. And while the trends have been heading downwards, we are seeing this huge influx of cargo that has really stopped the rate bleed we were watching happen week over week. Now, I'll discuss what just happened in Mexico in a minute, but we are seeing this big shift coming from the East Coast and going into the West Coast. And that's obviously in anticipation of that ILA strike, but it's also because of Golden Week. It's happening in China, and that's coming up between October 1st and October 7th. So shippers are trying to front load that inventory. They have been for a while, but now you've got kind of this double effect happening at once. So we're going to keep the same origin, China, Southeast Asia, but this time we're going to shift our destination to shipments that are headed into the U.S. East Coast ports. So right now, our East Coast rates on average, as of, and this is very important, this is not this week, as of last weekend, they were coming in at around 8,800 per FEU. So, this lane, Southeast Asia and China, into the US East Coast ports, it saw its high right around the same time as the West Coast. So rates were around $10,000, and it was about the first week of July. Since then, it's declined at a pretty similar slope up until this week. But we'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. Now, finally, let's talk about those Southeast Asia and China shipments headed into Mexican West Coast ports. So this is actually a very interesting lane. We actually started talking about this lane back in spring, and we noticed it was sort of the canary in the coal mine of what was going to happen in the U.S. West Coast. Not to get into a fact that I've said too many times, but it increased at an incredible rate, and then we saw the same thing start to happen to the U.S. West Coast. But carriers, they've announced a spree of blank sailings, and along with this pretty lofty $2,000 general rate increase. And in doing so, what was the most surprising part is that GRI, that $2,000 GRI, it mostly stuck. It basically pulled rates upward from 5,600 per FEU, which they were at before, and that was roughly 10 days ago, to 4,500 per FEU, all the way up to 5,500 per FEU. So roughly 1,000 of that stuck. Now, let's speed tour. If you know, you know. Let's keep going. Let's dive right into our transatlantic, and let's focus on the shipments that are leaving European ports now and headed into the U.S. East Coast. So if you're a Trans-Pacific shipper, you might want to cover your ears, or at least you might want to kick your accounting team off, because, you know, these rates definitely hurt in comparison to what you're dealing with on the other ports. But as of this week, Monday, our customers were paying an average of $2,200 per FEU on this lane. And as a reminder, we're shipping out of Europe and we're heading into the U.S. East Coast ports. Now, from a percentage standpoint, though, this $2,200 is actually a massive increase from what it was just at the end of August. So the end of August, we had rates at around 1,800, if not below 1,800 per FEU. And we just saw this just essentially a GRI stick, bringing it all the way up to 2,200. Now, let's continue on. Let's shift gears. Let's go over to our China and Southeast Asia shipments that are headed into Europe. We used to call this the Suez Canal lane, but obviously at this point, it's not the Suez Canal lane. At least most of it isn't. So what we've been witnessing here is really, quite frankly, very fascinating. It's been a massive change in price over the past roughly month and a half. So we saw this lane hit its peak price near the end of July. So different time than what we were seeing in the U.S. ports, particularly on the West Coast. And at its peak, this lane was $8,500 per FEU. Now, since then, what we've noticed is it has been the steepest rate decline compared to every other major ocean shipping lane, which is wild. Back during the pandemic, one of the very interesting things about this lane is it was like the steady eddy. Not to say it was affordable by any means, but this lane would move in a very gentle manner. It's actually, it was called one of the dirtiest lanes in the world because it just has so much traffic. And it's a good barometer of what's happening in the world shipping economy. At least it used to be a good barometer. What we've seen in the post-pandemic realm is this lane becoming a lot more volatile. It's been very, very fascinating. Literally during the pandemic, you'd see the U.S. ports just prices spike and drop randomly. This lane, very, very even keel. But now we're seeing, quite frankly, the slope of the decline in price. It's astonishing. So we were at 8,500 at the end of July. So month and a half ago. Now we're looking at shipment costs of $6,200 per FEU. We're talking about a 27% price decrease in less than 2 months, but really, if you round down, less than almost a month. So that's pretty astonishing. Now there is one other lane that just recently had a little bit more of a substantial move, but we'll talk about that very shortly here. So let's make a hard gear shift. Let's go back over to talking about what's going on with these negotiations, and just what's happening between the USMX and the ILA. So because of these negotiations, a lot of ripple effects have been occurring. And that's obviously because this strike is looking very imminent at this point. So a couple very basic things. So first, we're seeing East Coast spot rates. They are plummeting. Imports are obviously shifting over to the West Coast. Both of those things to be expected. But it's the dramatic way they're both happening that is kind of shocking. So when we look at the spot market for the East Coast, it's it's crazy. Just in the past couple of days, and this is the spot market, just the past couple of days, Asian shipments bound for U.S. East Coast ports. We saw an average price reduction of $2,300 in the past couple of days. That's wild. That's absolutely wild. And it's not reflected in the prices we just discussed because it's just happened so frequently and so quickly. And I think what's crazy is you've got to remember this lane was sitting at $8,800 and then it dropped, average down to $6,500. And quite frankly, we even have seen carriers posting rates as low as $5,500. So we're talking about more than a 30% price drop in a matter of days, less than a week. Just absolutely wild. Obviously, with this strike being at this point, it should be considered imminent. But this makes sense. But one thing is becoming really incredibly clear during this, and that's the carriers are getting very concerned about the lack of capacity of this lane, not only for a short period, but for their rotations of shipments for the months following this. And what they're doing is they're really willing to dig deep and give some deep discounts just to get you on these rotations, and some of which are even trying to get you into a contract at this point, which is, an interesting strategy, but it is something to consider. It's maybe a strategy you should seriously consider. The opportunity strikes. So anyway, but as a logistics organization, we cannot condone this route because what happens if you choose to go directly into a disruption is out of our hands. But we will try our best to help you if you'd like to explore this. Now let's kind of switch over. So from a contract negotiation standpoint, let's get back over to the ILA and the USMX in particular. So I think the problem here for all of us on the outside is we're mainly stuck in the dark. Thankfully, there's been a couple leaks that have given us some insight as to what's been going on. There has been a ton of saber rattling. It's been happening this entire year. But one thing has been pretty clear all the way from the beginning, actually announced, I believe, back in February, if not even the end of last year, was the president of the ILA said, if a contract is not signed by our contract expiration, we will strike. But then he later said, we are looking for the biggest wage increases in the history of contract renewals. So it was this kind of like, okay, wait, they never are signed on time. And you also want more than ever before. Definitely looked ugly from the very first couple statements. But we did get a couple leaks giving us a little bit of an idea of where each side is at. And, so what we do know is the USMX, they made this very public. And they made this announcement that said, hey, we're offering industry-leading wage increases. The problem here is it didn't say anything about what they were. No quantification, no detail. So there has been a couple individuals who have been very close to the negotiations who've kind of come out and said, okay, so USMX is offering a 39% wage increase, but that increase is going to happen over the lifespan of a 6-year contract. So what that's going to equate to is roughly $250 per hour per year increases for 6 years. And also that same source was able to kind of speak from the ILA standpoint and said, quite frankly, the ILA is looking for at a minimum double what the USMX is offering. So that is clearly a sticky point, especially given how close we are to the contract expiration. Now, a big point of contention as well, and this has been always the case, particularly when it comes to, this probably spans most of the unions, but as we focus on, port authorities and such, and longshoremen unions, both the West Coast and the East Coast, and obviously Gulf Coast, automation has always been a very, very big area of concern. And, the ILA has pretty much calling for an outright ban on not only fully automated processes, but also any semi-automated processes as well. So what the union's alleging is that the marine terminals have been automating their clerical functions, and they've been doing other automations as well. And they've been doing all of this without any sort of notification to the union, and that these actions are a direct violation of their current contract's workforce protections. So, these are the two largest issues on the table. Actually, there's a few others that have been bubbling up. But unfortunately, the talks are pretty much to standstill at this point. So The real takeaway here is treat September 30th as a day there will be a strike at the East and Gulf Coast ports, if not the day after. And you need to make sure you are planning in that way. If you have a ship on the water headed to these ports, it's critical you start working with your logistics team or your logistics provider and figure out a backup strategy, or even consider that merchandise, kind of stuck for the next 30 days. So, because it's not, if it's a strike for 3 days, that doesn't mean you can pick up your merchandise after that. The ripple effects are tremendous. So we are going to skip air rates today, but I am going to include them in next week's show right in the beginning. So make sure you're tuning in next week. It's Thursday, 1 p.m. Eastern time zone. We're going to be talking a lot about the TEU shift that's been occurring because of this imminent strike. We're going to walk through where shipments are going and where there's opportunities. We're going to try to discuss some strategies for you if you're finding yourself caught in the crosshairs. So make sure you tune in next week. We're going to try to dive into some of the details. I'll make sure I cover air rates right in the beginning, but I really appreciate you guys all for joining. Make sure you make it a great week, and I'll catch you next week, Thursday at 1 p.m. Thanks so much. Bye.